My name is Alan Armstrong. I'm the current head of the Department of Chemistry, and I'd like to welcome you all to this very special book launch event. We've got an amazing collection of people in the room, covering not quite the whole history of the department, but going back several decades, ranging from alumni to former colleagues to current staff and students to family members to friends of the department. So welcome or welcome back to all of you. So we're here to commemorate the launch of this really special book, which is a really rich and entertaining history of the department in its first 155 years. And I clearly can't summarize the whole book in a very, very short space of time. But I think it's fair to say that the department as a community has come a long way since these days. Since the very first origins of the department in the Royal College of Chemistry, and specifically with the appointment of, I think, this man here, the famous organic chemist Augustus Wilhelm von Hofmann, as the first professor of chemistry in the Royal College of Chemistry. And the Royal College of Chemistry and its successors have really been the pioneers of the story of Imperial College in many, many ways. We've been the pioneers, first of all, geographically. So the book traces our journey from our first premises in Hanover Square in 1845, and then mentions the first ever financial difficulties after just a very short time, and the move to cheaper premises in Oxford Street. And then we were, in the early 1870s, at the vanguard of the move to create a new area mixing creatively the arts and the sciences here in South Kensington. And so we moved across to, in fact, this building, which still stands today. And you can still see this as the Sir Henry Cole wing of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And you can still see in that building these characteristic tall windows here, which were the contemporary equivalent of fume hoods to release vapors out of the windows. And then we moved from there at about the time that Imperial College itself came into being to the Royal College of Science building, which of course, part of which we still occupy today. And then to what we call the new building, which is in fact built in the early 70s. And then at the end of the session today, I'll tell you a bit about the future, which continues the pioneering spirit, in telling you a bit about our move even further west, and the new chapter when we're going to be again, pioneers for college, the first academic occupants of the college's new campus at White City in the new Molecular Sciences Research Hub. But the book is actually more about people than about places. And we've really scaled the academic heights as a department. I counted, I think, 5 Nobel Prize winners who've spent their time as members of our community. Of course, most notably, the 2 men who made the journey all the way from undergraduate student to postgraduate to staff member before gaining that ultimate scientific prize, Sir Derek Barton and Sir Geoffrey Wilkinson. And I'm really pleased to say that we have several former colleagues and co-workers of those men here today to provide a link to their rich history. And we also have, I'm pleased to say, Sir Geoffrey Wilkinson's daughter, Professor Anne Hardy, so welcome. And we also have a special welcome to Professor Douglas Payne and Grace, who were students here at the same time as Barton and Wilkinson, and have contributed memories of those days in the early 1940s to Bill's book. So a special welcome. But as well as these heroes of chemistry, there are many other stories in the books of people who are real pioneers, inventors, and innovators. And I guess one of the most famous stories is the early one of Perkin and his accidental discovery as a student of mauveine, the first synthetic organic dye, which then led to arguably the foundation of the British chemical industry. So that's a very well-known story, but there are many, many others. I was really interested in the book to learn more about this guy, Herbert McLeod, who was an assistant to Hofmann and Frankland in the early days of the Royal College of Chemistry, and a great inventor who invented many things, including this eponymous vacuum gauge, which is still in use in the department. And again, there's a family link because we have present here today 2 grandchildren of Professor McLeod, Elizabeth Rogers, and John McLeod Hatch. Sorry. So welcome to you also. And you'll also find in the book many examples of pioneering women. So notably, the wartime work of Frances Micklethwaite and Martha Whiteley, which was recognized after the war with the award of honors, MBE and OBE. And they did amazing things contributing to our understanding of the properties of mustard gases, partly by experimenting on themselves. So they richly deserved their place in the history of chemistry. And then later, Elsie Widdowson was a student in the department who went on to put in place the foundations of a modern knowledge of nutrition during the Second World War. So a great history of pioneers, inventors, and innovators. And I think this spirit of using chemistry to produce things that are useful and tackle problems of importance to society is really what has made the department special throughout its history. And I'll just say that I think the great thing is that spirit is equally strong today. So here are just a few examples of recent startup companies or entrepreneurial activities led by students in the department. And I hope you'll get to meet some of these people during the wine reception. Particularly, I'll pick out this team here, this group of undergraduates known as Hidden Gems, who captured the cover of a recent ChemCom with their own independent work in which they developed a new, cheap, simple test to determine blood group types. So great history in the department. We owe a big debt to the authors of this book who brought it all together, Hannah Gay and Bill Griffith, both former students in the department. In Bill's case, you can see he's been here almost continuously since 1954, which is quite amazing. So I think Bill can lay claim to be a big part of the history of the department just by himself. Unfortunately, Hannah can't be with us today because of illness, but she sent us a message which will be read by Anne Barrett, the college archivist. But of course, Bill is here in person. So I'd just like you to join me in thanking Hannah and Bill for what they've done in writing the book, and invite Bill and Anne to come and say a few words.
Thank you, Alan. One or two things we want to put in the second edition, which I didn't know about. I'd like to start with you and Maria. Where's Maria? Maria, in particular, for doing a huge amount of work setting aside. I've not organised it. It's been you two. So thank you very much for that. You're a large audience. One of the reasons for that is that we started off by inviting the 130 people, 130 people who we acknowledged in the book. Their names are printed in the book because they gave us stories or facts, such. So, and a number of you are here, of that 130 are here. So thank you very much for coming. And thanks to all of you, of course, for coming, for making a long journey in some cases. Just like to mention a couple of people. Ed Smith. He's going to wear a peaked cap. There he is, standing up there. Ed read through all the proofs. Oh, well done, well done, Ed. Well done, thank you. Ed read through all the proofs and the page proofs, and invaluable because of Hannah's illness. She wasn't able to do that at the end, so he helped hugely. So I'd like to thank him. And also I'd like to thank Anne Barrett, our archivist, and she'll be following on after a few words from me. She'll read a message from Hannah. I just thought to say about Hannah that she's a brilliant person. She was, as you know, off the screen. She was here 58, 64, is it? Anyway, in the 60s, and I met her there, I knew her then. Worked with a very good friend of mine, Dennis Evans. And then she did something unusual. She went to Sussex to do another degree in the history of science. So she ticks all the boxes. She's a professional historian, I'm just an amateur historian. Well, that's true. I mean, so I think we've been a good team. We decided 2007, 2008 to get together to produce this book. She, of course, had produced, I don't know if some of you must know about the huge history of chemistry, history of Imperial College, 1907 to 2007, which ran Oxford Commission. So she knows a lot about the college, of course. 1907 to 2008, we added a number of years because we start here at 1845. We're the precursor, direct precursor of Imperial College. So we got together and we worked, I think, very harmoniously. Had a lot of help, particularly from Anne Barrett, who, and the other 130, but Anne's archive is superb. If you've never been to the archive on the 4th floor, you can't go today, but pop up and have a look. And her team extremely helped. So we produced this. What else? I was going to say something else, which seemed to be... Oh, well, yes, just to say, of course, that after we sent the manuscript in last January, she had 2 strokes, a smaller stroke and a more major one, for which she was hospitalised. But she's now making a very good recovery. She's not allowed to fly for this event, so she sends her best wishes, and of course you'll hear of this man. But she thinks she'll be fit to travel and be allowed to travel in September, October, in which case she'll be coming back here. One of the things, I've been here far too long, but one of the things I remember, I worked bloody hard. I mean, everyone works bloody hard, but also it's been fun. It's been a fun experience, and some of the fun, I hope, makes its way into the book, particularly perhaps chapter 8. But you know, there's some quite good stories, and many of you contributed. The Magic 130 contributed to that, and some are from us, of course. And the last thing to say is that it does occur to me, it's not a sales pitch, it does occur to me that it could be a very good pub quiz handbook. Okay? Just two things from that, because I think both Hannah and I have got an eye for the peculiar, you know, if not to say the absurd. How many of you know the know the name of the eminent IC chemist who declined an FRS, turned down an FRS, and the reason for him doing so? People turn down knighthoods. I mean, Paul Schofield turned a knighthood down 5 times. But I've never ever heard of anyone who turned down an FRS. But this chap did. So have a think. And if you don't know the answer, it's in the book. And the other one, which I think you will guess, a senior figure here a long time, who was shortlisted for the British athletics team, for the British athletics team, sorry, for the 1936 Olympics. He's in the book too. Okay, so Anne, over to you. This is Anne Barrett, our archivist.
Well, my thanks to Bill. And I must say that I'm very honoured that Hannah has asked me to read this. I've worked with her for very many years, and we have actually written historical papers together and things like that. And she's always a great source of information and help. So this is in her own words. I am very sorry that I am unable to be with you today, as I would have enjoyed seeing the book's formal launch and would have liked to have thanked many of you in person for the help you gave me when Bill and I were working on it. We couldn't have written it without you. I was persuaded by Bill to join him on this adventure. Reluctant at first, I very much enjoyed working with him. My chemistry is rusty, but I did recognise that the work carried out at IC was truly remarkable. It made me feel proud to have been a chemistry student here in the 1960s. I enjoyed my time at the college, and it was a pleasure to return as a member of staff in the Centre for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine while working on my earlier book on the history of the college. I very much hope those of you who read this new book will enjoy it and find it interesting. We've probably packed in too much information, but being positive, this makes it comprehensive. The college location in South Kensington has been important for everyone working in it. Students and staff have seen themselves as part of a local community that included some of the best science, engineering, music and art students, plus their gifted teachers. Now there is a new community to forge at White City, and the department is at the forefront of that, just as it was as Imperial's first constituent college in the 19th century. The founding professor, A. Wilhelm Hoffmann, emphasized laboratory teaching over the lecture room, something that continues to this day. The focus on bench work and the emphasis on synthesis has resulted in large numbers of new and important compounds being made first in its laboratories. Perhaps more important are the many new methods pioneered in the process. Hoffman's prophecy of chemists synthesizing compounds that would outperform natural products as pharmaceuticals and transforming medicine has come true. As now, Hoffman encouraged varying ambitions among his students. They could see a future for themselves in research or industry, in government service or as entrepreneurs. All were valued, then as now. Students and staff came from a mix of family backgrounds and nationalities. Among those in the departments in its early days were many now seen as chemical heroes. The early chemistry professors and their students had the kind of freedom and the opportunities that come when a discipline is still young and institutions are still small. Nonetheless, we still have heroes such as Nobel Laureates Derek Barton and Geoffrey Wilkinson. I hope you will read and enjoy our book and its launch. Wishing you all the very best, Hannah Gay.
Thanks very much, Anne and Bill. So we're now going to have 3 short presentations broadly representing physical, inorganic, and organic chemistry, respectively. And the first of those is from Professor David Phillips, CBE, OBE, FRS, who's an internationally renowned physical chemist who came here in 1989 from the Royal Institution and is going to tell us about his time here and his time for about a decade, I think, as head of department. So, David. Shall I sit on? It's on the Mac.
Oh, it's on there.
Yeah.
Just from the beginning. That's it. Okay, well, I've been asked to talk about physical chemistry, and historically I could do this and use all my allotted time to talk about the last century, or century before that, actually. So I'm going really to try and concentrate on the more recent past, and but just in passing mention a few of the prominent people who were here and who could strictly be called physical chemists. It's quite difficult because people didn't wear labels in the early days. You were a chemist and you might have dabbled in all sorts of different fields. But here, Crookes looked at the polarization of light, flame test, worked on soot. Whether he saw carbon-60 or not is debatable, I guess. Herbert McLeod, I put him in because we have visitors from the family, but also in my PhD I used to good effect a McLeod gauge all my life, and how I did not poison myself with mercury, I have no idea. Franklin, well, he did gas analysis. F.C. Tompkins is bringing us more up to date. He worked on absorption of surfaces, and he really played a leading role in the department, but was rather an ascetic man. He didn't interact with people terribly well, although David King, who worked with him, said he was a very warm individual if you got to know him. But his nose was put out of joint when Richard Barrow was appointed as chair of physical chemistry, and he became head of department. And Richard Barrow is one of the pioneers of working on zeolites, which have huge industrial importance, of course. He also was somewhat of an ascetic man. He, as you can see from his photograph, perhaps, he superb chemist, but rather aloof in the department, from what I understand. I only met him a few times. But he was succeeded by someone who was anything but an ascetic, the great, ebullient, wonderful electrochemist, John Aubrey. And John really goes down in history as one of the most flamboyant professors, I think, in this department. He was an electrochemist and like all, really founded a dynasty. Now, this is Phil Bartlett, who is a prominent electrochemist in the University of Southampton, which I know very well. And this, get the man's name right. Terrible thing, old age, isn't it, when you can't remember anything. I haven't written it down. So, oh yes, I have. It's Rob Hillman, who runs an electrochemistry group in University of Leicester. I won't mention the others, but partly because I have no idea who they are. This slide came from Phil Bartlett. I knew Phil when I was in the Royal Institution because we were working on some complex kinetics on different systems, but the kinetics were rather similar, and so we collaborated on developing models. Well, John really was here until I came here. So he was here until 1989, and really was an outstanding scientist and also a rather unusual and flamboyant man, as I said. I maybe shouldn't do this because it's not politically correct, but I will. So this is the John the scientist. He was known for his scientific acumen and his academic leadership. Joie de vivre and instigator of and participate in the sort of rambunctious student hijinks full of irreverence, laughter and alcohol that live on joyfully, it says, and sometimes embarrassingly in the memory. This comes from John's obituary a few years ago, and there's one thing I'd like to say, which is that, and this you can read it, but I'll tell you, he made no secret of his sexuality, perhaps unusually at that time. It wouldn't be so unusual today. And when he became Master of University College after he left here, he told the students how they should address him. So, good morning, Master, or good morning, Professor, but for his part, he would prefer to be addressed as hello, sailor, he said. Superb scientist. I had the good fortune or misfortune to follow him as Professor of Physical Chemistry. And my science was quite different, so I could get away with that. But how could I stand up to the expectations of being not an ascetic, but not perhaps in John's league? Well, I've tried very hard to think of anything which I have done in my life that John may not have done. And there is one thing, and I'll just share that with you. A long time ago, I spent a year in Moscow, in the then Soviet Union, working in the Institute of Chemical Physics. And the deputy director of the institute was a man called Nikolai Nikolaevich Kondratiev. And Kondratiev had one daughter who was a ballerina in the Bolshoi Ballet. She was one of the prima ballerinas. So I got to go to the Bolshoi quite a lot. I got to know her quite well. And on New Year's Eve, 1966, coming into year 1967, I was at a party in the flat. This is Marina Kondratieva here, and this is the lady in whose flat we had the party. This is Yekaterina Maximova, also a prima ballerina in the Bolshoi. Same partner, you notice, that's Vasiliev, who was the wife, the husband rather, of Maximova. Well, during the evening of this party, I got to dance with both Maximova and the Kondratieva. And I thought, I doubt very much that John Albury ever danced with the principal dancer in the Bolshoi Ballet, but I don't actually know that for sure. So, what was the department like when I came here? These were the physical staff that were in post, and if I've forgotten anybody, I apologize, but I did get the names from Bill's book. Lovett Reece. He, of course, had worked with Barrow on zeolites. Michael Spiro, who's here tonight. Maurice George, who's no longer with us. David Hayward, solid state, David Nicholson, computational chemistry, Jim Barry on polymers, Brian Levitt. Is Brian here tonight? No? Is he with us still? I don't know. Well, he originally did gas phase kinetics, but became very involved in administration during the time he was here. Richard Ash, David Bassett, Russ Egdor, Neville Parsonage. John was a visitor, and I had just arrived. What is remarkable about those people is they were still doing excellent science, but it's the average age which struck me when I first arrived. The average age of the physical chemists was 58. And Russ Egdor was a new blood lecturer who was around about 30, so he, actually, since he was on his own, he didn't bring the average down very much. And that really became one of the first jobs we had to do. It was a fantastic opportunity because there were a lot of people close to retirement. And so the college was quite generous in helping people to retire and with some buyback. And so we were able to refresh the department with a large number of new appointments. And it was a great time to be head of physical chemistry. So here are some of the new appointees. Gary Rumbles, who's now in the United States. Tim, who's over there somewhere I saw. And you may not know it, Russ Egdor only stayed a few months in my term of office here and moved to Oxford. And Tim may not know it, but he has Russ Egdor to thank for coming here. He may not thank him for coming here. Because Russ said there's this very smart young man in Liverpool, you should really try and get him. And we did. And Tim, of course, is now provost in the University of Birmingham, so he's had a meteoric rise. Well, you'll know some of these names. Not all of them are still here, but Seddon, Templar, Paul Wilde, who else? Anthony. And we did change the kind of mix of people. And what we introduced, or what my group and Gary's introduced, was photochemistry. So here you see a couple of us doing applied photochemistry in Southern California. What a handsome fellow Gary was, yes. That was taken just about a couple of years before we both came here. I want to say something about the state of the estate as well that we inherited. This building we're now in didn't exist. There was a hole in the ground here, and half of RCS1 had been knocked down, but they anticipated they'd knock the rest of it down. And so it was in this sort of condition. This is just tin sheet. And I'm not sure it was Steve or the next one out was yours there. And the conditions were pretty poor, and inside probably worse. And I think this is what it looked like when Steve or his colleagues were working there. Leaks in the roof. I mean, it was cold. It was really. It's incredible that Steve managed to do such wonderful work when he was working in those sort of conditions. So the hole in the ground proved to be incredibly useful because we used to hold parties there in the summer. These are some of my people, but recognize that face there? That's, where is he? Ah, yes, behind somewhere, yes. I've forgotten the man's name. That's terrible, isn't it? I've just been talking to him outside. Anyway, please identify yourself. Where are you? Oh, right at the back there. Yes, yes. Ian. We had... now, who's that? Paul O'Brien. That's Paul O'Brien. He was there. And these are all just taken, clearly, the memory of this has taken my senses away. Because there used to be very wild parties, I have to say. Well, we were fortunate enough to get money from the Wolfson Foundation to refurbish that part of the building. And if you now look at it, you'll see that it's in this sort of condition, much, much better conditions in which to work, and that still is how it is now. This is the opening, which is Wolfson turned up in person, and that's his wife, and that's the then rector Ron Oxborough, whose wife should have been there, but I was dismayed to hear him say to Wolfson that he was very sorry his wife couldn't be there, but she was out shopping, and that was a kind of calculated insult, really. Shortly after the opening, I had the pleasure of showing Princess Anne around the new facilities, or the refurbished facilities, and I was telling her in words of one syllable what people were actually doing. And halfway around, she turned to me, she said, "I'm not an idiot, you know. You can up your level of discourse quite considerably if you wish." So I then launched into something. She didn't understand a word after that, you know. And I was on the Mall last year at the celebrations, and we stopped and had a chat, and I reminded her of this occasion, and she pretended to remember, I think. Well, things really went well, I think, in the first 5 years that I was head of department, because we were in a period of replacement of staff. Money wasn't lavish, but it was okay. And what we had started in physical chemistry was followed through in the other branches, organic and inorganic. So we had a huge influx of new and very vigorous and very bright staff. Where we failed, I think, in those first few years is that the astute amongst you will have recognized that on my list of new appointees in physical chemistry, there was not one single woman. Well, there wasn't a married woman either, from that point of view. It was very, very difficult to attract applicants from female postdocs to come and do this. It's improved dramatically since then. But in 1997, coming towards the end of the time, disaster struck, really, the department. We had been a deficit department for a long time. I mean, in Steve's time it was true, and I inherited, as he had inherited, an accumulated deficit. But the way the college distributed its funds was through a vote formula, and they declined to change the formula, although they recognized there were special expenses for chemistry was an expensive department to run. The way they dealt with it was to say, well, you are allowed to run a deficit of this amount for this year, and provided you don't exceed it, that's fine. And the college accounts, of course, are reconciled at the end of each year. So it was kind of notional money, if you like. But in 1997, the hierarchy turned around and said, actually, you may not run a deficit again, and moreover, you must pay back the deficit which you have, which was then approaching 3 million. And since 88% of our expenses were on staff, the only way we could deal with that was to lose quite a lot of staff. And that was a painful and very difficult process for me personally, but for the department, because we had to identify people that would leave. I remember having a lunch with Tony Barrett in Chiswick to discuss how we could do this and what other things we could do that would make the department not focus on the financial problems, but focus on something else. And what we did was I devised a formula for looking at how productive people were. Rather terrible thing to do, but I had to do it. But we also thought maybe we could release more energy in the department if we didn't have the organic, inorganic, physical divisions, and we grouped people together in interdisciplinary groups or mixing people up. And people could choose, the staff could choose which group they wished to be in, and not only that, they could elect who they wanted to be group leader. And that's what happened. And it was amazing. I mean, the amount of new money that came in because of that kind of release was really quite astonishing. And it helped to get us out of the kind of problems that we had. I wouldn't say it was an easy time, but it was, we got through it all right. I just want to mention one person who I was a great admirer of, and he had come to Imperial in 1985 as a visiting professor in biology, in fact, through Jim Barber. But he is a chemist, a great George Porter, Lord Porter. And we managed to entice him to come to chemistry. And his legacy is at least two members of staff here, James Durrant and David Klug, who were his students originally. And one of the 3 Nobel Prize plaques that we have on the outside of chemistry is in his honor, and that was done in 2012, just a few years ago. And that's Stella Porter, his wife, and greatest admirer, I think. I want to mention Charles because I've made light of the kind of problems that we had from 97 through to the end of my time as head of department in 2002. And if life was getting me down, if I met Charles in the corridor and had a brief chat to him, I went away with a spring in my step. He was such a wonderful man at being sympathetic, being a fount of advice also, but just being Charles. It was just wonderful to be around him. And he's wearing his purple tie, you see, his mauveine tie. And that allows me just to finish by saying a few words about dyes. Linstead, of course, was a rector, and he was interested in phthalocyanine dyes. My own group were interested in phthalocyanines and porphyrins for photodynamic therapy, treatment of cancer using a dye and a red laser. James, at one point at least, used dyes for solar energy conversion. Fluorescent dyes are used universally in biological studies, and I had a hand in that. And so dyes have been, the interest in dyes, echoes of Perkin, if you like, are still there. Lady in the audience there, Marina Kuimova, who I collaborated with. She was a postdoc with me and is now a reader in the department. And she looks at dyes which change their fluorescent decay characteristics as a function of viscosity. And these measurements are made inside living cells. And so you can measure the microviscosity of where the probe is. And sometimes the viscosity changes when certain diseases affect the cell. And so it has some diagnostic uses. But this is not a scientific talk. This is just to indicate that we still have an interest in dyes. Well, the other thing I did when I was here was I'd come from the Royal Institution, and I was very interested in promoting science among young people. And so I used to give up to 40 demonstration lectures a year inside and outside the college. And perhaps of most interest is that before I came here, there was no schools liaison office and no outreach activity done across the college. And Eric Ash, who was rector then, asked if I would set up a schools liaison office, which we did. And that has morphed into the very effective outreach, Imperial outreach, of which I know there are representatives here tonight. So this is an artist impression of what I was like on the road. You can see this became my trademark, a glass baby. And I won't tell you why I have a glass baby, but if anybody wants to know, I'll tell you afterwards. One of the nicest things about being president of the Royal Society of Chemistry was this occasion, which John can remind me is a few years ago now, where Saif, Alexei Kornishev, Nick, and John all received medals from the Royal Society of Chemistry that year. And so it was a rather pleasing result to see that some of the recruitment we had made had led to success. Well, here we are in the year 2000, where the book finishes. And it's staggering, isn't it, to think that this is already 17 years ago. The department has gone onwards and upwards since then, but that's another story for other people. So what I would just like to do at this stage is to thank Hannah and Bill for really providing a book which I wish I had had when I came in 1989, because I knew not as much of the department as I should have done. And also thank the people who appointed me, prominent amongst them Steve, who was head of department when I was appointed, for allowing me the privilege of having such a wonderful career in this fantastic department. I came here in '89 saying I would give it 5 years. That's 28 years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing your great memories with us. Like all the speakers, David will be around, I think, in the wine reception to answer any questions or comments you might have to share with him. But we move on to our second speaker, who's one of our very newest appointments, representing inorganic chemistry, but also the increasingly important area of computational chemistry, is Kim Jelfs, who's going to tell us about her work in molecular materials design.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, so I'm a rather new addition to the department, so long after the period that this book covers. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the research in my group, which is focused on computational materials chemistry, but also talk about how we still have some links to the past in the department. So one of the first of those is that Alan mentioned that in the First World War, some members of the department were asked by the government to help, for instance, in developing respirators for the chemical warfare agents that were being used at the time, and they were working with researchers at Porton Down to do this. And in fact, in my group at the moment, I have a PhD student funded by researchers at Porton Down, part of the government's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, because unfortunately, in world events, chemical warfare agents are still relevant today. And what we do in my group is to use computer modelling to look at how these chemical warfare agents interact with models of materials in the environment to help with their research looking at the fate of those agents in the environment, and also looking to help in other areas such as detection or destruction of these agents as well. But from a personal perspective, my own PhD, which I carried out at the Royal Institution and at UCL, was looking at computer modelling of zeolites, so strongly linked with Barrow, who we've been hearing about as the pioneer of modern zeolite chemistry. But as well as that path to my PhD, my group currently researches a lot on porous organic molecular materials. So some examples of those are shown at the bottom. So these are some organic molecules that contain an intrinsic void, in some cases of a few nanometers. So when they pack together in the solid state, you have a porous material. And in fact, Barrow actually researched one of the earliest examples of these, which is this organic molecule here, dianine's compound, which doesn't contain a void itself, but when it packs together in the solid state, it can't pack efficiently, so it leaves voids between it. So as we see here in an image of that material packed together, you get these voids and these one-dimensional channels running through them. And Barrow showed that you could take up small gases into those channels, and he termed this an organic zeolite. So these porous organic molecular materials have seen quite a surge in interest in the last 10 years or so. And our group is looking at trying to use computer modelling to help discover new types of these materials. So the sort of applications that are being looked at for them are in molecular separations in particular. Approximately 10% of the world's energy usage revolves around molecular separations, so any improvements you can make can have a lot of potential benefit. But these molecules are also looked at potentially for sensing or detection, for catalysis, because they provide an enclosed environment which might alter your reaction pathways. And also more recently, it's been shown to be possible to make them into porous liquids. So as I say, we're trying to help discover new materials. So I'll make an analogy here. If you're trying to design your new department and you want it to have particular functions, then you hope you start with your blueprint and you're able to design in all the functions that you want in your new department. But by comparison, it's very difficult to do the same thing for materials, and particularly for the organic supramolecular materials that we focus on, because starting from your precursor building blocks, it's very unpredictable, the way in which they will assemble, typically. And even worse, it's then very difficult to predict their properties. So it makes it very difficult to design a material that has the application that you want. So as I said, in my group, we are computational chemists, so we're trying to use computer simulations to help narrow down the almost infinite possibilities in terms of materials you could make to those that are going to be the most promising in applications. So this is an example of a picture of the high-performance computing cluster that's located centrally in the college and which we use nowadays. And I know from reading the book that theoretical chemistry got off to a slightly difficult start in the department, but has for a long time been a strength. And not just in research, it's been integrated into our undergraduate teaching as well. And this continues now. Our undergraduates in their first term will start using Python initially to do some plotting and data analysis before they go on to do more sophisticated programming. And also in a computational lab I run in the second term of the first year, the students start to learn to do molecular mechanics simulations. And here I pick out an example which was actually taken from an earlier undergraduate lab that Henry Zepper had, where we actually get the students to do a conformational analysis on decalin, which is an example of one of the molecules that Barton actually did conformational analysis on in the department in 1948. But whereas that probably took him many months, our students are now doing that sort of simulation in a few minutes on just a desktop computer. But it's quite nice to have that echo to the past coming right in at the beginning of their undergraduate chemistry degree as well. So to go back to the research in my group, so we write software where we start with two-dimensional precursors. So we only know their two-dimensional structure of some organic building blocks, and our software will assemble them into possible materials, and in this case, possible porous organic materials. So we think of the sort of shapes we could form which might relate to platonic solids in this example. So we could rapidly assemble thousands of these molecules, but it's much more difficult to assess, A, if you're actually going to be able to synthesize them. That's a current massive thorn in our side always, but also what properties they're going to have and what application they could have. That's much more difficult for us to do. And we've got an additional problem of just the near infinite search space that we have. So if we think of one particular type of reaction chemistry, and that's imine condensation reactions that have been most successful in making porous molecular materials so far, so that this reversible chemistry uses an aldehyde and an amine as your precursor. And if we just look at online databases of previously reported aldehydes and amines that we could use for this chemistry, then we already have something like 800,000 possible precursors. And that's before we could even imagine coming up with additional hypothetical precursors as well. And if we then think of the different ways in which we could combine those and assemble them into these porous organic molecules, then we have something like 830 million possible molecules. And that's certainly not possible to screen in the laboratory, but it's also not possible for us to screen on the computer either. So what we're looking at doing now is to try to use approaches from artificial intelligence to try to more efficiently search this phase space of this chemistry. So one example of the way that we're doing that is to develop an evolutionary algorithm. So these algorithms mimic evolution in nature. We have survival of the fittest. So you start with an initial generation of candidates. You assess how good they are. And you keep the best ones and you modify some of them. So you try to mimic the mutations and crossovers in nature. And you keep iterating over until you hopefully get better solutions. So this is just a very simple example of showing how that works, where we have porous organic molecules, and we've just asked the software to try to increase the pore size that they have. So you can see we picked out different molecules from successive generations that are gradually increasing in size. So really that's all I wanted to say, but I wanted to also mention that what's been great since starting at Imperial just over 3 years ago is that we've also been able to start new collaborations with other departments here and try to use the same approaches in some of their problems. So, for instance, I work with the chemical engineering department, in particular Andrew Livingston, and look there at doing modelling of organic polymers that he's trying to make into membranes for doing separations. And also together with Matt Victor in the Department of Chemistry, but also researchers such as Professor Jenny Nelson in the Department of Physics, we're looking at organic molecular and organic polymeric materials that could be used for plastic electronics. And there we're particularly interested in contributing from our side, understanding of how these molecules assemble together, and also then trying to, in the long term, design molecules that have the properties that help us enhance the properties. So with that, I'll finish, and because I've been mentioning my current research, I should definitely finish by thanking my group, who are the people that is doing this research. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kim, for a wonderful illustration of modern collaborative research with echoes to the past of the department. So our final speaker is one of the world's preeminent organic chemists, Professor Steve Ley, CBE FRS, who has a very strong imperial pedigree, being a member of the department from 1975 to 1992, when he was sadly lured away to the BP 1702 chair in Cambridge, where he's been ever since. So Steve, we're looking forward to hearing about your thoughts on imperial chemistry.
It truly is great to be here. I am really privileged and truly honoured by this event to really be part of this Imperial College history. It is a very, very special moment for me. I must admit, looking at this crowd in front of me, I recognise vaguely many of the faces. 20 years on is a long time since I've seen many of you, but it's wonderful, wonderful to be back here, and I hope we'll get a good opportunity afterwards to meet up and to talk about the old days. Thank you, Bill and Hannah. You have produced something really very special. It'll be treasured for a long, long time by many of us into the future. Now, many of you who know me know that I have a very soft spot and very fond memories of my time at Imperial College, some 17, nearly 18 years, orbit a day, 18 years or so. And so it was really quite easy for me to agree to Alan's request. Would I come and say a few words at this book launch? He said there would be probably a couple of dozen people here or so. So little did I realize there'd be 350. But I think I judge this to be an expression of the esteem, the pride, the affection and loyalty that we have to this place. I think it truly is something very, very special. Yes, Alan made the point about they've undergone a lot of changes from the early days of the Royal College of Chemistry. That indeed is true to where you are today, but you will be moving into these new facilities in the White City, and all I can say there is congratulations. I am absolutely sure the ethos and the traditions will be maintained. I also have to confess, I'm just a teeny weeny bit jealous of what you have there. I sort of wish I was starting again, really, especially when I show you some pictures of the labs that I had to have at that time. Now, today, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to take you on a bit of a personal journey through my time at Imperial, because I started as a postdoctoral student and ended up being your head of department. But so I have experienced things from many sides. Now, as a student, many of the stories I could tell you would probably get me arrested, so I will have to back off on a number of those. But there are many of you in the audience that know exactly what I'm talking about in the process. So I'd like to start by showing you what my pedigree and what my claim to Imperial might be. Now, I know this is going to be difficult to see at the back of the room, but it's my chemical family tree. And what I want you to concentrate on are really the purple boxes, or the mauveine boxes, I should say, in the process. And I won't go through all of this with you, but I want you to see the connectivity. And I tell my students today, this is where you sit, right here below me, and this is your family, how it grows. And all of these purple boxes that you see are people of great influence at Imperial College, going back to Franklin the first and Hoffman the first professors of the Royal College of Chemistry. And I can lay claim on both sides of my family, if you like, to be connected in this sort of way. My PhD supervisor, Harry Heaney, I can track him back through to Pope. Pope's interesting because Pope left Imperial College to become the 11th 1702 professor at Cambridge. So I have some connectivity there as well. And of course, he worked with, well, he was supposed to work with Armstrong. They didn't sort of get on terribly well, and he ended up working a lot with Meldola. These are famous names. Our medals in the Royal Society of Chemistry reflect these giants of chemistry in the process. And through Playfair and on to Bunsen, the great German chemists, of course, Bunsen and Liebig, really seeded so much, especially in terms of organic chemistry, into the future. My first postdoc was in the United States with Leo Paquette, but that connected through Victor Meyer, who also had connections directly through to Bunsen in this process, so that again, there's connectivity. I could fill in with literally dozens of famous names of individuals as well, where there are connectivities that are important to me certainly. But if we go on the other side to Sir Derek Barton, the Nobel Prize winner, I'll say more about him later. Now, he didn't like to think he worked for anybody, but he was supposed to work with Heilbronn, and they had a little bit of a fracas, and it didn't work out terribly well. But he was banished to go and work. In the end, he mostly spent time with Mugden, who was a big friend of Duart Jones at that time. And then, of course, the track is fairly easy through Perkin and on to Hoffman, of course, himself. So I do feel a great personal pride in this connectivity to Imperial College, and I treasure that pride very, very much indeed. But you've heard that we had some interesting laboratories in those times. Grotty, yes, I'm going to show you even grottier labs in a moment in the process, but they were great places, generated tremendous camaraderie, and people supported each other enormously. This was my first lab, which was the Perkin Lab, In here, there was a big picture of Perkin up on the wall. Surprising how much of the top half of him looked like Sir Derek Barton as well in the process. Amazing connection there. And then, of course, I moved into the Whiffen Lab, which was next door. I'll say something more about that in a moment or two. These were some of my very first students that I had. You can notice no safety specs here, a lot of open reactions boiling away on the bench, successful reactions boiling away on the bench in the process. These were great times. Though I did have one other student that was not on this slide that I inherited from Len Owen. Len Owen had given up with this student. Len just really felt he couldn't deal with this individual. A guy called Marumbo Bombala. He came into my group, and I soon understood why Len passed him over to me, because it's the only student in all the years I've ever had who could set fire to ammonia in the process. It was a fearsome experience, I can assure you, in the process. But I did mention the Whiffen Lab, so let me move. First of all, just to show you that I came through the system here as a postdoc coming in 74 to 75. And even in that first year, Sir Derek Barton called me into his office and said, "I'd like you to stay at Imperial College and accept a lectureship." You imagine, in 1 year, I had really cracked it. I was excited. And then he said to me, "But you can't tell anybody." Those were the good old days when he said, "Because I have to fix it." And that's when people then could fix things. If only we could do that today, life would be so much simpler, I think, in the process. But he fixed it for me, and I went from a transition state of a lecturer to a full professor. That was a very difficult transformation. But Jeff Wilkinson was so supportive and strongly forced that one, I think, on the college. But I was very proudly appointed to a professor, and then, of course, became the head of department, sadly for just 3 years before I was tempted away to some nice new labs in Cambridge in the process. But let's talk about labs, because the Whiffen Lab was something and is something truly special to me. It's been part of my life for 43 years now, but I want you to understand why it has resonated and why it's been so important to me. Because if I show you this slide, these were the labs in the top of the old RCS building. This was one from Willie's lab next door to mine, but they were pretty well the same. Pretty drastically awful places. The fume cupboard consisted of a hole in the wall and a fan in the process. And we used to run interesting experiments there. Phosgene was quite commonly used in our labs. Even we had one day 2 liters of phosgene condensed in one flask in the process. Now, that wasn't too bad. We knew what we were doing, and we were handling this, we thought, very carefully. But that day, there was a knock on the window from outside of the lab. Tap, tap, tap. And it was a window cleaner. And he said, "Hey, mate, there's a funny smell out here." We advised him to run. But just to come to this Whiffen Lab, I mean, it was the breeding ground of many, many people. So Christopher Ingold was the first person to be the lab manager of the Whiffen. But the Whiffen, William Whiffen, was the first. William Whiffen Sr. was a student of Hoffman himself. So great connectivity there. And it was his grandson that in 1920, also called William Whiffen, then donated some money, 9,000 in those days, that was an awful lot of money, to build what they thought would be called an industrial laboratory. Because Imperial at that time wanted to bring the real-life problems of chemistry into and have students familiar with working at a bigger scale. And Ingold, I think it was about 1925 or so, then handed on to a guy called Ernest Farmer, who then took the lab right through to 1938, when Heilbronn came to Imperial College. And he decided he didn't want this lab as such. He wanted to turn it into a research laboratory. So it changed from a large-scale laboratory then into a research laboratory. And it bred some fantastic people over the years. These names should be well recognizable to any organic chemist, I think, and others in the audience. So the pedigree of that Whiffen Lab, in my view, was extremely special. And so when I did move to Cambridge, I was aware that that lab was going to turn into essentially a large air conditioning unit, which is what it did, sadly. But I wanted to take the name with me. I was wanting to pay homage to these great chemists. So I decided I'd call my lab the Whiffen Lab in Cambridge in the process. And you know, I never got permission to do that. None of my colleagues there ever dared ask me why I had done it. None of them asked me because they never called the labs by any of these special names. They were always known by their numbers, which I felt was very impersonal. But I managed to call it the Whiffen Lab, and within 3 years, the department was calling it the Whiffen Lab as well. And it's continued to be that way right up until this present time. It's called the Whiffen Lab. And it too, I think, has bred some fantastic chemists. And I'll say more about that in a moment or two. But it is curious that I was never challenged on that one. Where did it come from? Because I don't believe many people understood the connectivities in quite this way, and nor my passions also for why I wanted to protect the name of the Whiffen Lab. Although I suppose just about 1 year ago, Jeremy Sanders did say to me, by the way, Steve, why did you call it the Whiffen Lab? But that was some 23 years on in the process. Anyway, that's the end of that story. It was special, is special, and will maintain that very special place in my heart. And you'll see at the end why, as well, it has continued. I would love it to think it would continue even into the future. But part of your service in those days was excuse me, I need to go back one. There was some slave labor that we had to put in the process, and I was very happy to be a slave of this man, Sir Derek Barton, in the process. He too had students in the Whiffen Lab. That's just one crop of them that we had in those times. And he expected very high interest in these students. He wanted you to really supervise them on a daily basis. He had very, very high standards. And if you missed one little point, God help you when you went round to group meetings. It was an amazing training in how to run and operate research groups. So even though you could argue it was a bit of a prison sentence, the value that comes from these sort of lieutenantships are enormously valuable. And in my view, we don't do enough of these today. We throw people into the deep end and expect them to swim very quickly. It really does help if you can give people more time to mature sometimes into these sort of processes. Well, you can see what I have lost from that picture to today, namely my hair in the process, but it's even more noticeable here in the process. We did have long hair in those days. This was my first office. You will notice that there is a certain things happening here. Namely, I'm wearing a duffel coat, and I have Bunsen burners. That was because it was freezing in those days. We had to work in these conditions. Lab coats were not an option in this point in the process. But we got our work done. We burnt a lot of gas in the process, but they worked. This was my first office, and William Otherwell inherited this office after me. because I moved down and across the corridor into another office, again in the old building. You will notice here this is pre-chem draw days for the chemists in the audience, where we had to draw all our own structures at all times in the process. But it was a great time and great place because Willie was just around the corner and we had a lot of opportunities of talking chemistry. Free. We didn't have much money, but free from a lot of administration. That was important in the process. So then where? Well, we were growing up and we tackled some major problems. Indoneomycin was one major success. This was in the UK. This was the biggest natural product with 9 stereogenic centers. Nobody had done anything like this previously. And so we were competing in that era with the best of the American teams as well. And that was just a great time. I also jumped into some horrendously complex problems, namely this azadirachtin molecule that we worked on that took 22 years to solve in the process. And there are people in the audience who suffered as a result of that molecule. But you all know it was successful in the end, in the process. What a great training ground. 22 years of hard work. That's pretty good. But I need to talk about some of the people who were of great influence with me at that time, and indeed influence for many other people. Sir Derek Barton, I've mentioned him already. He left after just a few years, really, of me being in his group as a postdoc. Barton, as we all know, was Nobel Prize in 1969. For his work on conformation analysis. 28 years at Imperial College in the process. He gave a substantial amount of his life to Imperial College. He had a fundamental impact, of course, on organic chemistry, a worldwide revered and respected individual, and a great person to work with. We learned a lot from him. And after his retirement, we used to hold symposia in his honor. This was one of them that got organized by myself and Tony Barrett, although Tony Barrett was always insistent on the places that we should hold these symposia, namely in the most exotic and expensive part of the world that you can possibly think of. This was in Heron Island in the process. It takes a hell of a lot to get out there. But once you're there, you're trapped, and it's organic chemistry, really hardcore for a whole week. Apart from when you get chucked out of the lecture theatre by the dive club, and that can be a problem. But we had some wonderful meetings. Heron Island, that's why, in Australia, that's why I'm in short trousers. No other reason, folks, in the process. But still not as pornographic as David's picture earlier in the process. Let me also say something about Charles Reece. He succeeded, of course, Sir Derek. That was in 1978. A wonderful man. We've heard about him already. Witty, charismatic, a master of heterocyclic chemistry, but really a large number and generated a large number of fabulous stories in the process. Now, I'm not actually very good at telling stories, but there are two I'd like to just mention at this point. Imperial College in those times was famed for its colloquia. They were tough times. Well, at least for the external lecturer, they were tough times in the process. Charles always liked to preside at the front row on the left-hand side and then come up with the killer questions at the end of that process. But one day we had a less than spectacular lecturer who was working on some particular natural product, not very complicated, and failing badly to make it. Now, the audience were getting bored fairly quickly, but Charles was getting bored even quicker in the process, to the point his head was starting to nod, and nod quite seriously. And the audience started not to look at the lecturer, but to try and work out how long it was going to take for Charles to fall asleep. And the little sweepstake started in the back row of the lecture theatre across the way in the process. And of course, Charles succeeded in falling asleep fairly quickly. But Charles wakes up at the end of these colloquia with a really, really cunning question for the speaker. And so he wakes up and he said, "Now then, Dr. So-and-so, this molecule you can't make and I can't pronounce." That was, organic chemists in the audience would love that, I'm quite sure. But it really shows the wit and the energy of the man. The other one I'll tell you about is when Jeff Wilkinson introduced him at his inaugural lecture, which was a great occasion. Jeff being, and what you have to understand, being an inorganic chemist, and Charles an organic chemist. And Jeff decides that the audience needs to know the importance of inorganic chemistry and its mastery of the periodic table, and that organic chemists are really left with nothing very much, just around about the bottom end. Great introduction to somebody who was about to give their inaugural lecture in the process. But Charles was not daunted by this at all. He said, yes, Jeff, I had half a mind to become an inorganic chemist as well. But then, of course, that's all you need. So it was a lovely turnaround, an event which I remember. And that does bring me on very nicely to Jeff himself, who was my head of department for many years, an incredibly supportive individual, wonderful, wonderful character. Loved to think, we all love to think of him as a lovable rogue. I think we loved him. He liked to think of himself just as a rogue in the process. But he was a great influence on me and, of course, on science. Nobel Prize winner, as we've heard, in 1973. But he, too, has spent 48 years in Imperial College. He, too, has earned his time in the history of the department. Two quick stories I must tell you, because, again, they don't appear in the book in the process. One of them, when I was a beginning lecturer, I decided I'd go and talk to Jeff and see if he would like to collaborate on a project. Now, those of you who know Jeff know that this would be a very dangerous process. But nevertheless, I jumped in with both feet. I thought it would be a great idea to work and develop some chiral ligands and use Jeff's catalyst to do some asymmetric reduction of imines to create some chiral compounds. This was an unsolved problem then. It's hardly a solved problem today. I went and proposed this idea to Jeff, and he said to me, well, he told me to clear off, should we say. It was slightly different words to that, you understand, in the process. But in fact, it was very good advice. Essentially, it was advice, go and plow your own field is what he meant, and, don't even think about collaborating. But he let me down very gently at the end of it, as I was walking out of his office, rather downcast in the process. And he said, besides, anything with a chiral center in it, my eyes glaze over. For a Nobel Prize winner to say that was quite amusing in the process. The other story, which I think you'll also appreciate, was I turned up at Jeff's office one day. By the way, I always wondered why he never had a tie that actually worked properly. Never, in all the time I met him. Anyway, I turned up at his office, and as usual, there were no seats to sit on. I mean, there were seats in the room, but they were covered in books, as always. And this day, they were covered in the latest edition of Cotton and Wilkinson. There were 24 of them, at least, dotted around in the chairs of his office in the process, which he, of course, had got from the publishers for free. Please remember that he had these books given to him as the author for free. Now, I looked at these as a poor young lecturer and wondered if I could manage to talk Jeff out of a copy that would work. So I picked up what volume. I couldn't sit down. I had to pick up one of the volumes. I stroked it. I said nice things about it. I caressed it. I told Jeff it would look great on my bookcase, in the process. Jeff was letting all of this happen. And I thought, I've got to get it out of him. He got them for free, surely. Poor young lecturer, he's going to give me one eventually in the process. So I kept it going for quite a while. In the end, he just looks at me, snorts and grunts in the process and said, to you, 10 quid. It was a good buy at 10 quid, I can assure you, in the process. But that's the lovable rogue that we have in Jeff. There are many, many other things. The time's getting on, so I won't go all through these. But there were lovely events that I had, big grants, money did happen to us. Tony Barrett and I got very big grants very early on, which helped us enormously. Even Margaret Thatcher gave me 400k one time as a star of the future. And all the things I'd said about her as well. And Jeff, even more so. He was the scourge of many a prime minister in the process. But the only other organic chemist that was so awarded, also an ex-Whiffenite, was Jack Baldwin from Oxford, wherever that is in the process. Jack also received the support. But what else happened? Well, I have to mention this, the skip incident, since that made it into the book. Let me confirm that it is true that a professor of this department was found in a skip full of leaves with several of his students in a wine tasting that lasted quite late, should we say, into the night. That's as far as I'm going to go. Andy Dangle's in the audience. Talk to him if you need to know more about it in that process. But other marvelous things that did happen. With Bill, the development of the TPAP reagent. I knew we wanted a catalytic room temperature oxidant for alcohols, and Bill could count electrons. So it was a great combination. So it wasn't to be with Jeff, but Bill and I had a very, very profitable and lovely collaboration that's lasted for many years. That reagent is now sold worldwide, and if you look in SciFinder, you can see 30,000 references to individual applications of that oxidant now. That's a tremendous thing. The summer barbecues, we've heard about those. There was me doing a bit of practical work. Right on where we are today, this building didn't exist. This was our baseball pitch here. And we used to have our summer barbecues on that. And we had our own rock band, Don Craig on bass guitar. Wonderful, wonderful occasions in the process. And other things. And I must remind you of this one, the CDN, the Chemistry Department News, that was started by John Emsley and myself when I was head of the department. It really did help to improve the communication and interactions in the department. Yes, it was monstrously fueled by gin and tonic in the process, but it worked in the process. People often say to me, what's your proudest achievement, Steve? And it would be very easy for me to say, well, it's all the papers we've published, all the science that we've produced, from the Whiffen Lab and my other labs in the process. Actually, it's not what I would say. It's the people that have worked with me I have the most pride over. And I would like to just end on this point with you, because it's the people that I've worked with who have made such a difference to the science that we've managed to do. Now, this is just one statistic. There are 38 people here who have become UK academics. In other words, they've loved their chemistry enough to want to go and become academics. That, for me, is tremendous. 19 of them are now professors in this process. And 4 of those people are in the college now, but also Steve Marsden started his academic career. He's now left in 2001 to become a professor and now head of department at Leeds. But you will recognize your head of department, Alan Armstrong, worked with me. James Bull, now also a new lecturer here. Don Craig, of course, been a professor here for a while now. And of course, very recently, I was fortunate enough to go to Ed Tate's inaugural lecture in this very room. Brilliant lecture it was too in that process. But when I look through this list, this gives me a great deal of pride. These are the people that were trained with me in the Whiffen Lab. So I'll end just on these points, if I may, with you. We often asked Barton what was the requirement to be a great chemist. And he said, well, remember the 3 I's. You've got to be intelligent, and you wouldn't be at Imperial if you were not intelligent. You must have high integrity. You must learn from what your experiments tell you, believe in them, and use that in your science. He believed very much in that you must also work hard. Industry was extremely important. Nothing comes for free. And those were the 3 points that he made. I would add 2 more to them. One of them is be inspired. Be inspired by your science, be inspired by your work, be inspired by those around you, be inspired by your teachers in this process. But overall, I would say, be inspired by Imperial College London. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, for a wonderful set of memories. I should say, for avoidance of doubt, that the safety standards in the Whiffen Lab have improved somewhat since those days. Just need to get some final slides. So we've had a really marvelous set of recollections of the history of the department. And I said at the start that the next chapter in the department's history is our move to the White City campus. So I'll just tell you a very little bit about this. So we're going to be moving to this building here, the Molecular Sciences Research Hub, which we're very much looking forward to, which will give us amazing new research labs of far higher quality than the ones we've seen so many times on slides this evening. And the handover of this building to us, for which the external construction is now completed, is going to be in February 2018, so about a year's time. So we're looking forward to moving into it in the middle of next year. And I should say that we still will have a presence here in the South Kensington campus. A lot of our undergraduate teaching will still stay in refurbished labs here in South Kensington. So I hope a lot of you will still come back to see us in South Kensington in the future again. But I also hope you'll come and visit us in the Molecular Sciences Research Hub in White City, where we look forward to collaborating with many other departments and disciplines, but to continue the Imperial tradition of doing useful chemistry and solving problems that are real societal needs. So I think with that, it's time for the wine reception. I'd like to make a few more thanks before we finish. I'd like to echo Bill's thanks to Maria for doing so much work in organizing this event. An incredibly complex and large event, and we really need to thank her for everything she's done. Thanks again to all the speakers. Thanks to all of you for coming along to join us in the celebration of the book launch. And finally, before we go to the wine, thanks once more to Hannah and Bill for bringing everything together so nicely.